Our guest speaker today has a long and distinguished history in the era of anti-Nazi activities since World War II. He himself is the son of Holocaust survivors. In the 1970s, he was involved with finding Nazi war criminals who were here in the United States. I suspect many of them with the complicity of our government, but maybe he'll tell us about that. He has been a professor at SUNY Downstate Medical Center, and he has done humanitarian work in Kosovo. He will tell you about that also and how that relates to the issue of Nazism. And he has lectured extensively around the country on this topic, how Nazis turned healers into murderers. So please welcome our guest for today, Manny Becchier.
Well, thank you, Professor Kurland. Good morning, everyone. In my talk, I'm going to show you how healers turned into murderers, and more importantly, we're going to take a look at ourselves. We're constantly confronted with ethical issues when it comes to our nation's health. I understand we have some students here also there's a class in biomedical ethics here. That's great. In fact, I took a class here several years ago in biomedical ethics, and it was quite outstanding. With all the medical advances today that, with the promise of finding cures, along with the rising cost of health care, ethical issues will continually arise. The potential danger is that medical advances inspire new utopian visions of perfecting humankind. In other words, playing God. We might ask ourselves, what traits should people have that best serve themselves, best serve society? Engineering our population is nothing new. In fact, there's a word for it, applied biology. It's also been called racial hygiene, perhaps a more politically correct term. Today we're hearing a new term, designer babies. Now, wouldn't we like to give our children some genetic advantages? Now, why do I bring this up? The ethical decisions or choices that we find ourselves making today should not be taken without a critical examination of our past history. I'm going to show you that science is deeply enmeshed with culture and politics, and it can be exploited to justify some really, really horrible beliefs. It wasn't long ago when a nation became obsessed with public health, and their leadership attempted to genetically engineer and shape their society, to create, in their words, a master race. And this was a society that idealized the human body. It was reflected in their fine art, it was showcased in their museums and in their monuments. So I'd like to give you a glimpse into a society where public health played such a major role in their nation's vision. Now take a moment to read this public health vision. I don't know, it might be a little bit challenging for the people in the back, but if you're thinking about Nazi Germany, you would be partially right. I suggest that we need to look in our own backyard, because this was also us. Germany at the time was greatly admired in the United States. In fact, they implemented the most progressive public health policies. The objective of the German public health policy was to safeguard genetic health, to ensure the best possible medical care, especially for pregnant women and newborns. All the offspring had to be genetically fit. Women were encouraged to have many children. Mothers were actually awarded medals based on the number of healthy babies they had. In fact, if you had many children, you were given a government stipend. The vision was to create a master Aryan race by selective breeding, where the mates were selected, the offspring were cared for in government-run facilities. This was called the Lebensborn program. It means spring of life. Germany took a strong interest in racial hygiene. They sponsored research in human heredity, anthropology, and eugenics. Now, here's a question I'd like you to think about. Let me read this to you. How did these men and women who were convinced that they were doing good come to commit crimes that we today regard as the embodiment of evil? Very few people look in the mirror and see themselves as evil. So, how were they able to rationalize their behavior? How does one explain this indictment? 350 doctors were tried at Nuremberg, this is after the war, and they were not the so-called black sheep, the outcasts of the German medical profession, but rather they were a small part of a much larger group of doctors, university professors, and scientists, and researchers, all involved in medical crimes. So we need to explore, we need to ask, what role did the medical profession in Germany play in what became known ultimately as the Holocaust? I'll show you that it was a substantial role. Today, we make the assumption that these doctors were devoid of ethical concerns and we view them literally as monsters. Well, if we do that, that's the easy way out. Yet, there were ethical standards that governed medical research and the practice of medicine in the Third Reich. Now here you can see a photo of some nice, clean-cut young doctors. The doctor that's on the right, this doctor's area of interest was the genetics of specific proteins protecting against infections, also the heredity of eye color. He became the most wanted Nazi war criminal several decades ago. This was Dr. Joseph Mengele, MD, PhD. He was known to the inmates of Auschwitz as the Angel of Death. I kind of like this photo because it makes a point that evil is not always apparent. We can learn so much about the biomedical vision from the phrases the Nazis used to justify Nazi actions. These medical metaphors reflected the ideology that took Germany from forced sterilization to medical killings and ultimately to the death camps. The medical profession in Germany, until several decades ago, attempted to cover up their role rather than trying to understand what actually happened and how it was allowed to happen. In past years, we were presented with the myth of madness on the part of a few and the claim of coercion. But these were not madmen. Nor were they insane. And this is why it requires a critical examination of the medical profession to understand their behavior. It would be poor scholarship to characterize these Nazi doctors and scientists as mad, irrational, or devoid of conscience. Many of these doctors were highly regarded by the Western world. The academic stature of medicine in Germany was reflected by 8 Nobel laureates before 1939. That's more than any other country prior to 1939. And some of these internationally recognized doctors, they were in the forefront of giving credibility to the Nazi racist theories. Now, how is it possible? How is it possible that doctors were among the highest ratio of Nazi Party membership of any profession? How do you explain the attraction? We could call it a biomedical vision with its emphasis on biology research funding, and let's not forget career opportunities, because party members were able to fill the vacancies of the Jewish doctors that were dismissed from their medical institutions. The Nazi state promised to be a hygienic state, and applied biology was so integral to their worldview. So from the perspective of the Nazi ideologues, sterilization, euthanasia, which they called merciful treatment, these were considered public health initiatives. Laws were instituted for the protection of German blood and honor in order to identify pure Aryan blood. And public health issues were instituted to control reproduction and, in their words, eliminate the biologically threatening genes from their population. The photo I have here is from a German publication. These were the winners of the Nordic Features Contest, and it was strictly based on their view of the physical features of what the ideal Aryan individual would be. In a way, I look at this as similar to our state fairs when you would give an award for the prize-winning bull or hog. A series of laws were introduced in Germany in 1935. These were known as the Nuremberg Laws, and they included genetic rules as who was Jewish. This chart distinguishes different degrees of what they called racial pollution. Now let's look in our own backyard. As strict as these laws were, they do not appear as strict as the laws in the state of Virginia at that same time. And I don't know if you could read this. The term white person shall apply only to such persons that has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian. So you see, a barrier was created separating the Aryans from the other, quote, the other. But now this barrier has a biological basis. Before it was religion, it could be any number of things. Now, how legitimate is such a barrier? The basis seems to be primarily observable physical characteristics. Your skin, the texture of your hair, the shape of your nose. In reality, in many cases, there were actually no notable differences between Germans and German Jews. It would actually make more sense if we had if they had to separate people by blood type, separate blood type A from B. I mean, there you could give a transfusion to the other. The point that needs to be made still today is classifying people is a subjective process, and it's influenced by cultural ideas and political considerations. So let's take a brief look at the foundation for this thinking and the initial steps on what we can call a slippery slope, and that is eugenics. Eugenics is literally an effort to breed better human beings, and the principle is strengthening the biological group. This is an attempt by society to take over control of the evolutionary process. And the thesis of eugenics arose from social Darwinism. Societies evolve much in the same manner as individual species. It's also referred to as applied biology. Now, this is not something that was dreamed up by the Nazis. The inspiration came from the United States. Eugenics actually means well-born, and the lofty goal was to improve the human race by special breeding. Now, this is a poster from the United States from the early 1900s. The message is that you need to get checked. You need to be genetically unfit, and what we need to do is to sterilize certain individuals in order to create a stronger species. In fact, today, I mean, we use genetic testing today, but it's optional in most cases. In Cyprus, I believe you cannot get married in the Greek Orthodox Church without genetic testing for thalassemia. Now this was the public perception at the time. You had the high cost of caring for the mentally ill, and this was something that was burdensome. And this can be justified by using ethics. Well, if we apply the utilitarian ethical principles where the focus is on the consequences. The eugenic influence throughout the United States was quite powerful. 28 states were able to pass sterilization laws. There were courses given in eugenics at the leading universities throughout the country. And the headquarters, the eugenics headquarters, was right here on Long Island, Cold Spring Harbor. Eugenic advocates at the time, they gained influence in the legislatures of the United States and in our social service agencies. It made perfectly logical sense to so many Americans. Enlightened public health policy, racial preventive medicine, this was the thoughts here. Even the Supreme Court endorsed aspects of eugenics. In the infamous 1927 decision, Buck versus Bell, our Chief Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he upheld Virginia's decision to sterilize an 18-year-old institutionalized woman after she gave birth to, and I quote, imbecile. That, by the way, the term imbecile was a legal term at that time. Years later, this, quote, imbecile made honor roll in a school. This decision opened up the floodgates for thousands of Americans to be forcibly sterilized. And I find it interesting that the attorneys for the Nazis, for the Nazi doctors, the defendants at the Nuremberg trials, they quoted Justice Holmes' words in their own defense. Following the lead of the United States, Germany instituted similar laws, and the United States provided the legal basis for sterilization in Germany. What Germany did was they actually copied virtually the laws of the state of Virginia. Dr. Ernst Rudin, he was the architect of Germany's 1933 sterilization law, and he helped write the official interpretation, which mandated the involuntary sterilization of those suffering from genetic diseases. They set up hereditary health courts. With these hereditary health courts, it gave the appearance that there was oversight, that there was an opportunity to redress errors. It consisted of a lawyer and 2 doctors, and it lent the appearance of justice and due process. Hearings usually lasted only a few minutes. It's important to bear in mind that the model for German sterilization laws was the United States. Before the Nazis, the United States actually led the world in forced sterilizations. And that's a fact that did not escape the Nazis. This Nazi propaganda poster from 1936, it justifies the sterilization law. It's kind of hard to see. It shows a German couple surrounded by the flags of the various nations which already had identical sterilization laws. It was the radical adaptation of eugenics and racial hygiene that culminated in the Holocaust, and the principal players were the medical profession of Nazi Germany. The term euthanasia, it comes from the Greek meaning the good, or the good or well or beautiful death, and it refers to the inducement of painless death for a chronically or terminally ill individual. Now, this way of thinking influenced doctors, and the medical personnel carried out the killing of over 100,000 mentally and chronically ill as part of their formal euthanasia program. The common wish behind the euthanasia program was to establish a future idyllic society, a society free of genetic disability. It will be a society where there will be no diseases, everyone looks good, where life is beautiful. So once you accept the attitude that there is such a thing as life not worthy to be lived, and this would be based on your concern with the severely and the chronically sick, you'll soon be ready to expand your definition of undesirable people. Perhaps people with different shaped eyes or lips, skin color. And this is what happened. Gradually, the sphere of those to be included in this undesirable category was enlarged to encompass the socially unproductive, the ideologically unwanted, the racially unwanted, and ultimately all the Jews. The question inevitably is asked, why the Jews? The choice of the Jew was rather easy to achieve within the Nazi ethic. It was easy because it fit perfectly into a long Christian history of anti-Semitism, a history that systematically depicted the Jew as the mythological symbol for evil. Now this, coupled with the eugenic theories, the doctors in Germany believed that the elimination of certain people, it was painful, but it was a necessary duty, and it was something that was required of them in the service of public health. The killing program was viewed as a necessary biological purge, and the German medical profession saw themselves as servants of the state rather than as individual doctors. So in their worldview, they were able to redefine what is good and what is evil, and consequently they were able to act in good conscience. This is some clips from a public health film called The Eternal Jew, and it showed the image of rats, and it was superimposed over images of Jews spreading disease. So the message here is clear. Of course we need to eliminate disease. The German public was very heavily propagandized. What this says, which I'll translate, because God cannot want the sick and ailing to reproduce. And this reflected the medical thinking of the day in Germany. The mentally defective were viewed in purely economic terms as a national burden. So this so-called cleansing of the race, it grew an appeal to the public. And it also reflected the utilitarian way of thinking. Even in school mathematics books, they had illustrations on what is the cost of mental illness. The program was administered, it went under the code name T4. Actually, that's the address of the headquarters in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4. And the doctors were empowered to grant a mercy death to patients considered, in their words, incurable. A diagnosis of feeble-mindedness, that's what provided the grounds in the majority of cases, and that was followed by schizophrenia and epilepsy. So there was no problem diagnosing feeble-mindedness as anyone that was hostile to the Nazis. The euthanasia decree was provided to the directors of all the German psychiatric institutions, and what they did was this established the criteria for death. So who were these victims? In short, they were all the people who were unable to work and were considered a national burden. These were the directors of T4. In January 1940, Dr. Karl Brandt and his colleagues, they tested a novel means of mass killing using carbon monoxide in a gas chamber disguised as a shower. This was set up in the Psychiatric Institute at Brandenburg, and it was replicated also at 5 other psychiatric institutions. The victims predominantly children. They were transferred to the extermination hospitals by bus. The windows were covered up. I don't know if you can see it, but the windows were opaqued out, so you could not see the victims that were penned up inside. The doomed were bused to any of 6 psychiatric extermination centers, and on arrival, the children were undressed, they were photographed, they were numbered, they were led by a nursing staff to the facilities, and there they were poisoned by injection, or they were left to starve to death. False death certificates and letters of condolences were sent out to the families. And the cause of death was pretty much chosen at random. The methods for euthanasia were later improved by a Dr. Werner Haid, who utilized carbon monoxide gas disguised as showers, and that's what became known as the prototype for the final solution. This gas chamber, and you can see the blueprint of it, it's disguised as a shower. It was at the Hadamar Psychiatric Center. It could hold up to 65 children at one time. Dr. Werner Haid, he was the top expert in mercy killing, and he was one of the heads of the T4 program. The first systematic murder of concentration camp inmates was under the direction of teams of doctors. The medical staff of T4, they were all transferred to participate in the genocide of the Jewish people beginning in 1942. This was Operation Reinhardt. Documentation has revealed that almost all of the key personnel of the death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and the Treblinka death camps, they originated from the T4 facilities. And you could see Belzec had 130 medical staff, Sobibor 106, Treblinka had a 90-member staff. Under this program, experienced doctors were transferred to death camps for, in their words, the words was Sonderbehandlung, which means special treatment. And the doctors were key to the success of the death camps. They organized and they carried out nearly all the aspects of the operation. And this is what we mean by slippery slope that ultimately led to the Holocaust. When the Nazi doctors began their program of sterilization and extermination, most of them were operating on the firm conviction that they were serving not only the German people, but the future of man. Now, what was the extent of the doctors' involvement? Throughout the extermination process, the doctors were involved in each stage, in the selection, in the authorization, the execution, the research, as well as supervising the killing in the gas chambers. Now, they were not ordered to do this. They were empowered to participate. I'll give you a brief summary of the doctor's role in the camps. Only a brief, because the details, they can be found in the proceeding of the doctor's trial of 1946. The doctors were given the major responsibility of murder, and they presided over the killing process. Now, how ironic was it that the poison gas that was used at Auschwitz was carried in a Red Cross marked truck and was dispensed by the SS Public Health Bureau office in Auschwitz. On a personal note, this is my mom. She survived the death camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau, and she became that number that was tattooed on her arm. She feared the doctors the most. They were there every morning at the appel. Appel means roll call, where you'd stand up straight for hours at a time, and the doctors would walk up and down, and they would select those that they felt were not healthy to put in a full day's work. So it was critical to never give the appearance that you were ill. And my mother knew that, and She knew that no one ever returned from the camp hospital. So she would at times cut her finger, rub some blood into her cheeks just to give herself a healthy glow and not look too pale. How can one begin to describe such horror? The Nazi doctors conducted such horrific types of experiments on concentration camp inmates, and they did so in good conscience. A large part of this research was devoted to the science of destroying and preventing life, such as mass radiologic experiments by Dr. Karl Klauberg, Horst Schumann, and so many others. The most widely used means of individual execution was under the guise of medical treatment, and it was the intravenous injection of phenol or gasoline. Dr. Gebhardt, he was one of the many doctors, and he did sulfanilamide experiments where they would inflict wounds and purposely infect it with bacteria and rub in ground glass and to measure the effects of the treatment. And I only mention this because this Dr. Gebhardt, he was the president of the German Red Cross. With the rationalization of gaining new scientific knowledge to improve the health and the well-being of society, one can begin to understand why there were so many doctors that injected all kinds of diseases into patients in order to examine the various stages of disease progression. And I'm not going to take the time now to cite any of the individual cases. There just are so many. The Nazi experiments on human subjects are very well documented, and as I said, there were many doctors at so many camps doing a wide range of cruel, unethical experiments. Medical students were practiced and operated on people regarding their particular specialty. Pharmaceutical companies sponsored experiments and testing, such as Bayer Pharmaceutical. You all know, you all take their aspirin. These experiments were not kept secret. The findings were published and they were distributed to the German medical profession and even a number of post-war scientific publications. For the medical profession, this was paradise. To this day, researchers have found themselves citing data from Nazi experiments, and this presents a number of ethical issues. Documentation has been compiled and has been presented in the doctor's trial of the Nuremberg Military Tribunal. So to quote the prosecutor, the prosecuting attorney, General Telford Taylor, he said, and I quote, "This policy of mass extermination could not have been so effectively carried out without the active participation of German medical scientists." At the doctor's trial, this was the first of 12 trials for German doctors. Of the 23 defendants, which I put their photographs there, 7 were acquitted and only 7 received death sentences, and the remainder received light prison sentences. Virtually all the thousands of doctors that were involved with cruel, unethical experiments, with torture and murder, they got away, and they did not face any consequences. Most doctors didn't have to run or hide. They just had to resume their medical practice in Germany or the other countries. I'm not going to take the time to mention who these doctors were or what they did. I will only mention now one doctor who came to the United States with the help of our CIA. Now, if I haven't shocked you yet, I think this will. This was Dr. Hubertus Strughold, MD, PhD. He is known as the father of our space medicine program. He was a medical pioneer of our manned spaceflight program, and he was the chief scientist of NASA's Aerospace Medical Division. He played a key role in the Apollo program, putting a man on the moon. And Dr. Strughold he was brought to the United States at the end of World War II as part of Operation Paperclip. This was a top secret operation to bring to the United States top German scientists to help us in what was called the Cold War, which was just getting underway right after World War II. This was where the Soviet Union became our #1 enemy. Over 1,500 German scientists were brought to the United States by our intelligence agencies, and in this photo you can see some of them. Arthur Rudolph, I believe he's fourth from the left. He headed our Saturn V moon rocket program. Wernher von Braun, I'm sure you all heard of Wernher von Braun. He was responsible for putting the first man on the moon. This is Wernher von Braun, probably the most famous scientist in the United States. Good-looking, charismatic. He was treated by the media like a rock star. The CIA scrubbed his record clean, hiding the fact that he was a Nazi war criminal who contributed to the death of thousands of prisoners at the Dora camp, where prisoners were starved and they were worked to death in these underground tunnels producing the V-2 rockets that were launched to kill people in London. Well, getting back to Dr. Strughold, his crimes were covered up and they were glossed over by our military, which saw that winning the Cold War as its all-consuming priority. Documents from the Nuremberg trials linked Dr. Strughold to medical experiments in which inmates from Dachau concentration camp were frozen to death in the attempt to try to resuscitate them with hot liquids. Prisoners were often stripped naked and tied up outside overnight in temperatures well below zero. And the attempt was to see if they could revive them. In addition, there were some other experiments in which prisoners suffered horrible, painful deaths in low-pressure chambers. When I tried researching Strughold's war crimes in the mid-1970s, I was blocked. It was classified. And in the few documents that I was able to obtain, his name was whited out. Even our immigration department, INS, in 1974 stated that they could find no evidence connecting him to medical crimes. So he was very well protected by our CIA. I was working at the time with several Nazi hunters who blew the whistle on Dr. Strughold, among other Nazis who were able to find a safe haven in the United States. Now, Strughold, he died in 1986. Finally, after 3 government investigations and political pressure, his name was removed from the International Space Hall of Fame. This was in 2006, which considered this is 20 years after his death. And the coveted Hubertus Strughold Award, which was given every year to top scientists since 1963, finally ended just last year. It's clear that we need a code of ethics in this age of high technology and terror. And as a result of these past horrors, the scientific community has attempted to take steps. So we have what's called the Nuremberg Code. A number of years later, this was followed by the Helsinki Declaration, and also various other safeguards were eventually implemented. By the way, the first principle of the Nuremberg Code is the voluntary consent of the person to any treatment. That's something that is absolutely essential. As a result of the crimes of the Nazi doctors, we have been confronted with many medical ethical issues. I actually was confronted with a medical issue when I was a student in 1968 at the Medical College of Georgia. And in my anatomy lab, I referred to the most beautiful and accurately detailed medical atlas. It was called the Perkoff Atlas of Anatomy. I see these illustrations as masterpieces. I did not realize at the time I was using a Nazi atlas. Dr. Edward Perkoff, he was the dean of the medical school in Vienna, and all his medical illustrators were Nazis. The bodies were obtained, approximately 1,400 cadavers were delivered by the Gestapo. Whether they were from inmates in the camps, we don't know. Letters were sent to the medical center, and they were not really very cooperative. The question is, should we derive benefits today from what the Nazi doctors did? Now, what if the Nazi research can save lives today? So, we're confronted with difficult ethical issues, and actually I'm planning to give a talk on this at the Medical College of Georgia this March. All these issues, all this raises a point that Albert Einstein expressed quite well, and let me just read this slide to you. It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. A point I'd like you to consider is what can possibly happen when we are empowered by new medical advances and technology. Now, in conclusion, with the many medical advances that are taking place and the rising cost of healthcare, we need to look at ourselves. We need to look at our eugenical aspirations. And we need to be aware how easy it is to go down that dangerous road. So thank you all very much, and in the remaining time, I'll be delighted to take any questions you have. Thank you.